the year 1900 was also a year, 10th of March 1900. That's when the Buganda Agreement was signed, and we handed over, boom, to foreigners. And guess who we handed over to? Some fellow who came with 2 people and simply began recruiting among us and simply began to use us to fight each other. And Uganda, and in general Africa, became a 4-tier class structure. The first category were sons, please mark, sons, not daughters, sons of chiefs and priests. These had privileged access to education, and they in turn formed the bulk of the cadreship of the colonial and neo-colonial state. Think of your first prime minister. Who was your first prime minister in 1962? He was the son of who? A chief from Lango. Who was your first minister for justice, 1962? There was a man called Grace Ivinjira. Does anyone know about Grace Ivinjira? He was son of who? A chief from Uganda. Cluster number 2. It is an army from people or societies we call acephalous. Acephalous societies mean those places where African groups lived but didn't have centralized kingdoms, kings, or rulers. Centralized kingdoms were like Buganda, Bunyoro, and many of those that you know. They had chiefs, they had kings, and guess what? They had armies. So the British had to recruit from societies called acephalous, where there were no centralized authorities. So the colonial rulers, therefore, recruited from tribes that had no centralized administration. This is very important. Field Marshal Idi Amin Dada was a representative of an army from acephalous societies, not educated, because a very educated army, the colonialists thought or knew is very difficult to manage. Now, these groups that the colonialists used, for example, in Uganda or DRC or South Sudan, there's a group of the Luos called the Kakwas that stride those 3 countries, South Sudan, Congo, and Uganda. There were groups like the Yaos, these were in Malawi. There are groups like the Gurkhas in Myanmar, or what we call Burma. That way, the colonial state was able to neutralize much of the anticipated rebellion in the hinterland by playing divide and rule between groups. That's cluster number 2. Cluster number 3 is a small Afro-Asian group that was allowed to process cotton, coffee, tobacco, run hotels. In Uganda, this group were mainly Omani Arabs and Gujarati Indians. Omani Arabs, having established vassal states before the Portuguese arrived around 1495. The Portuguese found them at the coast of Mombasa, in Malindi and Zanzibar. The Indian groups from Gujarat, which is northwestern India, had come as railway construction workers in 1896. So in 1949, if they got you who looks like me trying to process cotton, they would arrest you. You're not allowed. Your work is to grow the cotton and take it to a ginnery. The one who packs the bales and makes yarn should be another person. Partly, those were the riots led by Musazi Ignatius, who is buried at Kololo, one of our heroes, because they were asking themselves the question, how come for us as black people, we cannot process coffee? The 4th and last category that emerged between 1900 and 1962, for the case of Uganda and largely across Africa, the 4th category formed the bulk of the population. And by 1969, when I was born, these were 96%. In Uganda, these were 96% of our about 9 million people at the time. This category were pre-industrial, semi-feudal. They were All of them peasants. Who is a peasant? We know who a peasant is? He or she goes to a forest, cuts a tree and makes a bed. He or she grows the food for eating. He or she falls sick and goes into a forest and gets some herbs and makes medicine, and he cannot commercialize that medicine. The genie pool for enterprise, the genie pool for innovation, the new creations of a young society, which would in turn drive manufacturing and later on exports, was badly blunted by 68 years of a colonial state. By 1971, the illiterate military officers, led by Idi Amin, took power. This is because they had tasted blood when the army was tested blood and power. When the army was introduced in our politics for the first time in 1966 by attacking the Kawaka's palace, not far from where we are, simply because there had been a constitutional dispute that would have been resolved by talks, but it was resolved by military means. Now, so when the army took over, that small army, illiterate from acephalous classes took over, well, the sons of priests and chiefs who had been the small backbone of our civil service, many were killed or they were quickly hounded into exile. And then immediately they were followed by the small entrepreneurial class of Asians who were given 90 days to leave the country they had called home for more than 7 decades.